Hey, what is up everyone? Welcome to our latest video in the Unpopular Cards series. This video is thanks to Lord of Pies, who recommended I do a video on interesting mana rocks. As a reminder, I respond to every comment on each video, and after each video, I will pin a comment after 3 days, deciding what video topic I will post about. So if you have unpopular topics that you would like to be discussed or covered in one of these videos, then let us know in the comments below and you might get pinned. So yeah, as the comments mentioned, today we're covering unpopular mana rocks, which is a category that is very oversaturated with the same mana rocks slotted in everyone's decks because they're considered, to be the most optimal, but it's also pretty boring slotting in the same things in every single deck, but just differing based on color or what your commander is. So in this video, my argument is that many of these rocks that I will cover today can actually synergize with your deck strategies and be more valuable than your traditional 2 or 3 mana rocks that you see in every deck. If there is a card that you see today that you like enough to buy, it would mean so much if you use my TCG affiliate link in the description below to support the channel. But with that being said, let's jump right in. Our first and most popular card today is Victory Chimes, which is played in 0.39% of decks that are able to play it. This is a 3 mana artifact that says, untap Victory Chimes during each other player's untap step. And for tapping, a player of your choice adds 1 colorless mana. So this is actually super interesting, and here's why I like this as an unpopular mana rock option. 1, the first time it comes down, it can generate 3 mana until your next turn. So per turn cycle, this can generate 3 mana, which I can't really think of many mana rocks that can do it. Maybe some of the Relic of Legends type effects. But I say 3 because it's important to note that this is untapped only during each other player's untap step, not yours. So that's the price that you have to pay, but you can use this the turn it comes down to pay for 1/3 of the cost. Then if you cast, another spell in your turn, you can use that. Then it untaps on the next player's turn for you to use, then player 3's turn to use, and then player 4's turn. But you need to be careful how you use it and if you use it on player 4's turn, because it won't untap during your turn. But nonetheless, that is great. The fact that it can pay for itself before your next turn is something that is not very common for mana rocks to be able to do. This might not appeal to everyone's decks, but if you run a lot of interaction or play a lot of spells on other people's turns, then this is an excellent option for you. I don't personally own a Gem Lightfoot Sky Explorer deck, but this is a card that I would include if I did, because Gem wants to do things on other people's turns. So that's basically 3 free mana each turn cycle. But this commander, isn't the only one on the list that cares about this type of thing. Some other commanders I like for this card are Hilda of the Icy Crown to pay for 1 activation each turn, Alayla Cunning Conqueror to help get a token on each of your opponent's turns, Krufix God of Horizons, you can just tap that and store the mana from turn to turn. Same thing applies with Omnath Locus of All. So each turn cycle, that's 3 new mana that you are storing. And then Marchesa Dealer of Death to pay for the card draw ability every time that you commit a crime on somebody else's turn. The second thing that I like about this card is it has the flexibility to do something that not a lot of mana rocks are able to do, and that is Politic. You can partner with opponents to give them an extra mana to cast a removal spell, or a board wipe ahead of the curve, or maybe strike a deal with them to help get their commander out a turn early if they do XYZ to other opponent, or if they don't do XYZ to you. This just adds, I think, so much flexibility to the right decks. But like I said, it depends on your deck. I hope this can give people an unpopular mana rock idea for a commander deck that maybe you own. This next one is for all my token deck friends out there, and that's Wand of the Worldsoul, which is in less than 1% of white decks that can play it. Wand of the Worldsoul costs 2 and a white, and says, Wand of the Worldsoul enters the battlefield tapped. The tap ability is, you can either tap to add 1 white mana, or you can tap it to give the next spell you cast this turn Convoke. Okay, that is very good. Yes, it is a bummer that it comes down tapped, but so does so many other mana rocks. You just have to pay the price for 1 turn in order to gain access to an insane ability that, if it isn't dealt with, this alone could honestly put away games and cast spells way ahead of the curve, 4, 5, 6 turns ahead for the rest of the game. Convoke is just such a good mechanic, and here's a few reasons why. 1, it counts as generic mana or colored mana. So most cost reduction cards in the game is just in the form of generic mana. So being able to add colored mana dependent on the creature that you're tapping is incredibly powerful. If you have some white and black creatures on the battlefield, you could be all tapped out on lands and tap 5 creatures to pay for an ink shield out of nowhere. Or normally, people can guess what kind of answers you might have in your hand based on the number of untapped lands and your color, your commander's color. But with Convoke, you give 0 hints to what is in your hand, because a lot of the time, people don't attack with their creatures in order to leave open blockers. So it's not a dead giveaway. You could just cast an EDHREC out of nowhere, or heck, even a Cyclonic Rift if that is your thing. Reason number 2, this works for any untapped creatures, including ones with summoning sickness or for mount type decks. So if you're worried about the setback of this coming in tapped, it can make up for it a turn later by turning your creatures, which are usually useless the turn they come down, into mana rocks. Number 3, it's actually not inaccurate to say that the ceiling of this card is infinite mana, and any variation below that, thousands, hundreds of mana. And if you aren't generating or creating infinite number of creature tokens, then it's really not uncommon to see someone generate 32 Scoop Swarms in a turn, and yeah, they have to normally wait the next turn before those are valuable and can attack. But with this, if you are in a go wide deck, you could tap those 32 Scoot Swarm that were just generated this turn to create 32 mana for a 30 plus buff with Finale of Devastation. This card, of course, does very well in token decks, but even in any ordinary deck, if you're used to having 2 or 3 creatures out on the board, then 1 cast of Convoke with this card can make it worth playing over something like Boros Signet, which is in almost 300,000 decks and has 0 variety. It just does the same thing every turn, every game. But with this, I like that it can just tap to give the 1 white mana, or it can create an absolute haymaker on turn 4 by casting an 8 or 9 drop after this is untapped. Our next card is Pillar of Origins, which is played in 0.36% of total decks that can play it. Pillar of Origins is a 2-mana artifact that says, as Pillar of Origins enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. And you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, but can spend this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type. I really don't have too much to say about this option, and it doesn't excite me as much as some of the other cards I'll highlight today, but I'm including it because it is a very relevant option for a lot of the Kindred decks out there. It's nice that this comes in untapped and it adds a color of any mana. So if you're running a Sliver deck or, a Vampire deck, Dragon deck, or any other Kindred deck with a lot of creatures of the same creature type, then this will not be a dead card in a lot of your games. For those who do run Tribal or Kindred decks, how many creatures do you think you need to have of a given creature type in order to justify playing this card? Because I personally don't have any Kindred decks, and so I don't run this, but this is an option for those out there who might not know that this card exists. Next up, we have Jeweled Amulet, which is played in 0.35% of decks. This is a 0 mana artifact that has quite a bit of text, so we're going to go right into it. For 1 and tapping, you can put a charge counter on this artifact. Note the type of mana spent to pay this activation cost. Activate only if there are no charge counters on this artifact. Then you can tap it to remove a charge counter from this artifact. Add 1 mana of this artifact's last noted type. This is a unique one that essentially lets you save a mana to use on a separate turn. But I do think that there are several use cases that make this card better than what it seems at the surface level and as a great mana rock option. So the first is in proliferate decks. The big downside, obviously, to this card is that you can't activate the first ability to put on another charge counter on it if there is already a counter on the card. So you can really only use the mana adding option every other turn. But in a proliferate deck, you only need to get 1 charge counter on it, and then you can proliferate and use the option of removing a charge counter every turn instead of taking every other turn to build it up. The second use case is for storm decks. So decks that care about storm count or maybe a certain threshold of spells cast in a turn. So Stella Lee Wildcard cares about the 3rd spell, or Saruman of Many Colors can easily reach the 2nd spell because the first one is 0 cost, so it's free. A third type of deck that this could be useful in is historic decks, or decks where the commander cares about casting triggers for artifacts. So commanders like Joyra Weatherlight Captain to draw a card for 0 mana. We got Teshar Ancestor's Apostle to get that activation for 0 mana. Alistar the Brigadier or Psy Master Thopterist all get free triggers from the 0 mana artifact that can also be used to ramp. Fourth, a creature with 3 or more mana pips. So what I'm talking about is, let's take, for example, some pretty popular ones. There's Balin the Haymaker and Ishin Two Heavens as 1. A turn 1 Soul Ring will not help to cast these commanders because they need color pips. But with Jeweled Amulet, you could cast these creatures on turn 2 if you really wanted to. On turn 1 or 2, you need a land that creates 1 or more colors of mana. So a command tower or any shock land or dual tapping mana land will work great because, I mean, if you're playing a 3 mana deck, you likely have one of those in your opening hand. So on turn 1, you play a Stomping Ground and charge the Jeweled Amulet for red. On turn 2, you play a Plains, tap the Stomping Ground for green, tap the Plains for white, then tap Jeweled Amulet for red, and that's a cast of a 3 mana commander on turn 2 with 3 different color pips, like I said, that a Soul Ring could not help with. But with these examples that I shared, you probably don't want to do that because with Balin, you want to have setup, or Ishin, you don't have any attack triggers to double up when it's coming down. But if you are playing, a commander with several color pips and you want to get them on the battlefield as quickly as possible, then this is definitely an excellent option for the exact reasons that I just shared. So that's 4 reasons. I'm sure there's plenty more out there, but like I said, I think that this card has a lot more use cases than people give it credit for at surface level, because it does seem to be like every other turn I get 1 mana. Cool. If you are enjoying these cards and the conversations, I'd definitely love to invite you to our Patreon Discord. We discuss all things unpopular cards and decks and have access to over 400 unpopular deck lists and descriptions for your brewing inspiration. Anyways, our next card is Thran Turbine, which is played in 7,037 decks. Thran Turbine costs 1 mana and says during your upkeep, you may add up to 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. This mana cannot be spent to cast spells. Alright, so this technically isn't really a mana rock, but it can be an unpopular enabler in the right decks. So it only costs 1 mana. It's likely to not be a magnet removal, and over the course of the game, this can contribute so much mana to decks that care about activating abilities. So one thing that I will say is noticeable about this card, and is A downside is that the mana needs to be spent in your upkeep, or else it will just disappear from your mana pool. So as a result, this card goes very well in clue token decks, which can perpetually give you a free card draw every turn, because you should definitely have a clue, an extra clue lying around, I should say, that you can spend 2 mana to cast for free, like I said. There's also many commanders that have activated abilities, like Grenzo Dungeon Warden, to possibly cheat in a creature for free in your upkeep. There's Bone Beguiling Balladeer, which cares about foretelling, and since Thran Turbine gives 2 mana on your turn, you can use this to foretell a non-land card from your hand each turn for free. Brimaz Blight of Areskos cares about incubator tokens, so this can transform one into a creature for free every turn. Or there's Atla Palani, Nest Tender, who you can use to pay the activation each turn to create an egg token. This is also an option for commanders that I mentioned earlier that can store mana, like Omnath Locus of All, because you lose that mana, but instead of losing it, it gets converted into black mana that you can use later on in the turn. And so, super interesting find that I think can work in several decks. We're on to our 6th card today, which is Manascape Refractor, which is played in 6,817 decks. This is a 3 mana artifact that says, Manascape Refractor enters the battlefield tapped. Manascape Refractor has all activated abilities of all lands on the battlefield. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to pay the activation costs of Manascape Refractor's abilities. I love this. I think it's such a unique ability in a mana rock category that is filled with so many of the same text boxes. And what's great about this card is that it looks at all lands on the battlefield, not just yours. So in a game with 4 players, there's a large number of targets that pool together that you could target. Of course, it would be cool to have, a Gaia's Cradle as a mana rock, or a second Cabal Coffers in a black deck, which totally can happen. But when this isn't hitting the ceiling, the potential for this card is still very strong. Across 4 players, like I said, there's likely to be a bounce land that can tap for 2 colors, or man lands. We got Tron lands that can also tap for 2, legendary Kamigawa assist lands like Minamo School at Water's Edge, and then there's also transformed lands like Primal Wellspring, who lets you copy an instant or sorcery if you use the mana to cast one. Lake of the Dead, utility lands, and there's just so much more. At worst case, this taps for a land type that you control, which is honestly not far off from the baseline that other 3 mana rocks already do. But this card scales with power levels, and as people play more busted and expensive lands, you're more likely to be able to have really good activations as people start playing those said Gaia Cradles like mentioned earlier. Are there any other great land targets that I didn't mention that you think this card could copy and have a great activation for? Alright, I think that this next one is really unique and a super fun one. It's called Serum Powder and is played in 2,030 decks. This is a 3 mana artifact that says, tap to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. Anytime you could mulligan and Serum Powder is in your hand, you may exile all the cards from your hand, then draw that many cards. So essentially, this is I think super unique because it's a strange ability referencing mulligans. So for anyone interested what formats this is legal in, it is legal in Modern, Legacy, Vintage, Commander, and Oathbreaker. But yeah, effectively, this gives you a free mulligan. So notice, however, that it does say draw that many cards. So if you're playing Commander and didn't like your first hand, you use your free mulligan, then draw 7 again. Let's say you don't like your hand again and you mulligan down to 6, and this time Serum Powder is in your hand, you can exile those 6 cards, then draw 6 cards again. Instead, so not 7, but you get to have another chance, draw 6 cards instead of going down to 5. So if you are frequently finding yourself mulliganing a lot, then maybe this is an option that you can consider. But other than that, there are some other options that I think that this deck or this card could function in. For example, this can be played in Aketramos the New Dawn deck. Ramos has a text that says, Ramos can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. Well, if you mulligan for free and draw 7, that is 7 cards in exile. So you play your commander on turn 3, and immediately on turn 4, you have a menace, lifelink, indestructible creature that can attack or block. There's other cards as well that care about cards in exile. So here's a few. One is if you have a Slime Against Humanity deck, you could exile like 3 to 4 slimes in an opening hand. So the first time you actually cast a Slime Against Humanity, you create a 6+1/+1 counter card instead of just 2. There's Huskburster Swarm, which costs 1 less for each card or for each creature card you own in exile or your graveyard. So this could be, a turn 3, turn 4 drop. Crackling Drake and Beacon Bolt are 2 Izzet cards that care about the number of cards in exile. Then there's Mist Hollow Griffin and Squee the Immortal, which can be cast from exile. And Karn the Great Creator can fetch back an artifact that you exiled in the opening hand. So this might not be considered even a good mana rock by any means, but it is incredibly unique. I think it's fun and can lead to memorable games when you're actually able to pull off the free mulligan. That's what I love, I think, about Unpopular Cards, is they do things that people aren't used to seeing every day, and in the right decks, it could actually be a helpful start to the game with multiple cards in exile. Our second to last card today is Charmed Pendant, which sees play in only 773 decks. This is a 4-mana artifact that says, tap. Put the top card of your library into your graveyard. For each colored mana symbol in that card's mana cost, add 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. Play this ability only anytime you could play an instant. Then, in parentheses, it clarifies. It says, for example, if the card's mana cost is 3 generic, then blue, blue, and black, you add blue, blue, and black to your mana pool. And I'm actually really glad that they add this clarification, because it could be kind of confusing, like, all right, generic, blue, blue, black, I only add blue and black because those are the 2 colors that are in it. But no, so this in a dream scenario could actually hit a Progenitus, then you add 10 mana pips, not just the 5 WUBRG mana symbols that are in the cost. So right off the bat, I will say that this card, being 4 mana, is more than your typical mana rock, but it is something that you can build around and try to maximize to receive the value that you get. So first of all, this can go well in top deck manipulation kind of decks. You can optimize your rolls to make sure that you get the most of the mana from your ability. So if you have a commander that cares about scrying or surveilling like Glarb Calamity's Augur, then you could likely get some pretty good activations every time. This also goes well with graveyard decks because it goes from your library to your graveyard. So that's another method of using a mana rock to help fill up your graveyard, which is what you want. The obvious use case for this card is for decks that care about mana pips. So once again, I'm looking at you, Omnath Locus of all players. Man, they really are just getting a shout out a ton in this video. You could also probably apply this to Ramos Dragon Engine or Joda Archmage Eternal decks, or even some of the Niv Mizzets that care about 2 color cards. I think this would be a great option. Having a mana rock that can come in untapped and consistently give 2 colored mana in those Niv Mizzet decks is still, a great option. But if your deck does play cards with a lot of 5 mana pips, or in the case of Omnath, you're trying to at least get 3 mana pips of different colors, then this could be a monster of a mana engine. So aside from Progenitus, which I mentioned earlier, there are the 10 ultimatums, all of which would add 7 mana if you hit those. I won't go into this one too much, but let me know in the comments below if there are some other great cards that I didn't mention that if you hit, it would add over 5 mana because there's over 5 colored mana pips. The last type of deck that this could really be strong in are monocolored decks. And that's because monocolors usually lets you play spells that you aren't able to play in other decks because there are so many color pips of said color. So think, Eluge the Shoreless Sea, who can easily play cards like Archmage's Charm or Blue Sun Zenith. There's Cryptic Command, Seagate Restoration, Mass Manipulation. We also have Enter the Infinite or Invoke the Winds. All of these cards are pretty tough to play even in a 2-color deck, because having 3 or 4 mana pips is just very limiting even for 2-color decks. So usually these are pretty restricted to just monocolored decks. The same applies for other colors like Phyrexian Obliterator or Phyrexian Vindicator. And then there's things like Tribute to the World Tree and Archdruid's Charm. So things that have 3 or 4, if you're running a lot of those, then that's a great hit. But even, like I said, if you hit 1 or 2 consistently, then this can be a pretty good mana rock option, especially since it doesn't come in tapped. Once again, if there is anything you see today that I'm able to convince you to use, despite being unpopular or suboptimal, I appreciate those of you who take the extra few seconds to use the TCG player link in the description below. The support that you give really does mean so much. Thanks, everyone. Our last card today isn't one card, but rather a whole set of very unloved cards, the Ramos artifacts. So all of these artifacts cost 3 generic mana, tap for 1 specific color, and have an activated ability that lets you sacrifice it at instant speed to add 1 additional mana of the color that it taps for. Maybe, I'm missing something, but I really like these. I think that these can be great, especially because the sacrifice ability is completely free. And, there's just so many critical points in a game where you just wish you had access to 1 more mana. So something like Simian Spirit Guide, obviously that's from your hand, it's a surprise, but on the battlefield, that can also be pretty helpful. So in descending order, Heart of Ramos taps and sacrifices to add red mana and is the most popular option with 1,790 decks. Eye of Ramos is next, which taps for blue and is in 1,457 decks. Skull of Ramos taps for black and is in 1,257 decks. Tooth of Ramos taps for white and is in 1,069 decks. Then we drop all the way down to Horn of Ramos, which taps for green and is in 514 decks. So yeah, I get why Horn of Ramos isn't played too much, because in decks with green, I usually prefer permanent land ramp spells instead. But for the other options, like decks that have no access to green, I really think that this can be a good card, especially in monocolored decks, because you don't need other 3 mana rocks that tap for Wooburg if you're in a monocolored deck. And like I said, tapping for your color, then sacrificing for that color can be an extra mana needed to cast a game-ending spell. Or I think a lot of people just, when they see that you're tapped out on all your lands and all your artifacts, they've probably never seen this card before played, and so they totally forget about the activation ability, and so they cast what they think is a game-ending spell, and then you just sacrifice this to cast a Swan Song to counter it, and they're like, oh man, I totally forgot that sacrifices to add mana. I just saw you were tapped out. And I'd imagine that probably happens pretty often. But that's all that I got for today's video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? And like I said in my last video, leave a comment for any unpopular video highlight that you would like me to cover. I will pin a comment after 3 days, and the pinned comment will become a video that we cover. So thanks so much for sticking around if you've made it this far, and I look forward to chatting with you all in the comments below.